Hello everyone, my name is Reese Lindmark and you are listening to The Reese Show. On this show, we're trying to clarify what a good future looks like. I know we're all a bit sad about late-stage capitalism, and we want to transition to something, but we don't really know what's next. So, on the show, we interview experts about what is emerging, this beautiful future vision that we can all lean into. I hope it gives you a sense of purpose and clarity about the future. If you like the show, feel free to do something about it. You can leave us a 5-star review. You can tell your friends. You can name your first child Reese. Whatever makes you happy. And if you really dig it, we have an online school called Root, where we help folks understand these root level systems to find our route forward. We have cohorts of world-class systems thinkers that run every couple of months. So if you're interested in that, check us out at root.co. That's ROOTE.co. Thanks. Today I interview Roman Krznaric about his latest book, The Good Ancestor. It's a great podcast. Roman and I got along well together. And we chat a lot about language, which is always fun. Hope you enjoy it. Hello, listeners. Today I'm chatting with Roman Krznaric. And Roman is a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society. And he has a latest book out, which just came out in the United States. It's called The Good Ancestor, A Radical Prescription for Long-Term Thinking. And it's described by U2's The Edge as the book our children's children will thank us for reading. And his previous books, including Empathy, The Wonder Box, and Carpe Diem, Reimagined, have been published in more than 20 languages. He's also a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. I'm really excited for this. And Roman, thanks for being on the show and welcome.
Really looking forward to the conversation, Reese.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun. Roman and I the other nice thing for us is we are getting to take a break from the U.S. election. So we get to chat for this hour thinking long-term instead of, minute by minute, which is nice.
Well, I'm looking forward to that as well, actually, that, elections are classic myopic events focusing us on the here and now with good reason, of course, but there is a need for us as societies to think far beyond the here and now.
Exactly. And let's kind of dive into that for a second. So as a high-level overview for our listeners, we're going to chat mostly about Roman's book, The Good Ancestor, and a little bit about kind of the mindset itself and how we can kind of cultivate this long-term mindset in ourselves, and then also how that mindset then gets manifest in institutions and things like that. So let's start, Roman, with just kind of, I loved how in your book you talk about these 6 ways that we can think long. So tell us about how we can think long and be a good ancestor with those 6 ways.
Well, the whole idea of being a good ancestor is a concept I kind of stole really from the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine, as you probably know, back in the 1950s. And in later life, he said the big question facing our society is, how can we be good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And he thought if we're going to be remembered well, we'd need to extend our time horizon. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we should be thinking on a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And I think once you start grappling with that idea, you need to start, really challenging the short-termism of the modern world, because we know most of our politicians can't see beyond the next election or the latest tweet, and markets spike and crash in speculative bubbles, and we're constantly pressing the buy now button and looking at our phones. And the way I've tackled this is to come up with these 6 different ways to think long term that you mentioned there, Reese, which is kind of like a mental toolkit for extending our vision towards the future. And there are various different ways of thinking long term. Some of them are about grasping deep time. Others are about considering issues like intergenerational justice, cathedral thinking, striving for transcendent goals, developing a legacy mindset, and holistic forecasting. And they're all tapping into different parts of our capacity, our extraordinary human capacity to dance across time horizons. Because yes, we can all be looking at our phones, but in the next moment you could be thinking about saving for your children's pension, or thinking about writing song lists for your own funerals. And it's that long-term capacity which has enabled us to build the Great Wall of China or voyage into space. And of course, this is exactly what we need today to deal with major challenges like the climate crisis, which is a long-term, you know, challenges which will be playing itself out over decades and centuries, or the challenges around artificial intelligence. Are we going to be living in a world of lethal autonomous weapons in 10 years or 20 years? Are we going to be living in the world of Blade Runner 2049 in 2049 or not? These are the kind of questions that I've really tried to tackle in this book.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you said at the beginning, which is that you use the term stole, which is great because it's like there's this idea that ideas come from both, like we are a vessel for them. And so it's not like, I just love that frame that you put there of like, it's not like you came up with this amazing idea that like, hey, we could be good ancestors. It's like, no, there's this thing in the past and you're just kind of revitalizing it and adding a modern spin. And I think that that's a great way to kind of be less individualistic with our thinking and to say, hey, this is an idea that is emerging from the past and like the current present, and I am a vessel for it. Does that kind of align with how you're thinking about, surfacing this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a believer in something that H.G. Wells said, which is that human history is, in essence, the history of ideas. That ideas shape our minds, what is thinkable and unthinkable. And, you know, in academic terms, I guess there's a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, talked about this in terms of a habitus, the sort of set of ideas which shape our worldviews. And I know that, on your podcast, it's partly driven by ideas around cultural evolution. And I
Mhm.
like that idea very much myself, that we are swimming in a world of ideas which we are constantly borrowing and changing and that are metamorphosing through time. But those ideas really shape society. I mean, if you look through human history, ideas have made all the difference. The idea that the earth is at the center of the universe or not, the idea that men are superior to women or not, the idea that humans are separate from nature or not. And when these fundamental ideas change, our political, economic, social structures change along with it. So I'm very much driven by the power of ideas, borrowing the ideas of people like Jonas Salk, but also trying to really surface thoughts and metaphors which can speak to us today. I really think that idea of a good ancestor speaks to us today. A lot of people talk about intergenerational justice, for example, when they're thinking about long-termism, which is a concept which works for me, but for some people it feels a little bit distant. It's about people out there who may not be born for decades, but the idea of being a good ancestor, it's about me. I'm that ancestor. Its question is, how am I going to be remembered by future generations? And I think it situates us a bit more firmly in the long span of human time, which goes back tens of thousands of years, even further, and will hopefully go on millions of years, maybe into the future, if we're lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said there about, I mean, on that H.G. Wells quote, it reminds me of a friend who's, just talking about how thinking, what thoughts are unthinkable today that were, and or what thoughts are thinkable today that were unthinkable in the past, or vice versa. What thoughts are unthinkable today that will be thinkable in the future? And so, yeah, I think this power of ideas to shape the world is really powerful. And I think that you specifically, I think you do a great job of, the kids these days might call it memeing or something with like Good Ancestor is just, it's a good meme. It's like that is something, it's a good metaphor that should be spread in society. And you have a couple other ones that I think are really good. There's this time rebel, intergenerational justice, which you mentioned, this acorn brain, the ethnosphere, and these future holders. I want to talk about time rebel for a second. How do you tell us about that piece of language, what that means, and how to use that as a metaphor?
Yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that because I worked really hard at inventing that concept.
Nice.
Because to me, it really captures the idea of a new kind of political struggle we need to engage in, which is to bring future people into our decision making. I mean, if you think about it, I used to be a political scientist, apparently an expert on democracy. This is about 20 years ago. And it never once occurred to me in that time that we disenfranchise future generations in a similar way that women or maybe slaves have been systematically disenfranchised in the past. Future generations are given no political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. And I think we need to be taking their interests into account because our actions have such impacts on them. And to be a time rebel, really, I feel is about caring about the welfare of all those future generations, bringing them into our minds when we're making big decisions. And what really inspires me is that as I've done this research for this book over the last few years, I've seen a rising time rebel movement emerge. I've discovered in a way that around the world, there are people who are dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice. So, in the US, for example, there's an amazing public interest law firm called Our Children's Trust, which has launched a landmark case against the US federal government on behalf of 21 young people who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. It's called the Juliana case. They've also filed cases in many, many states as well. But there's something extraordinary happening here, right? Because it's probably one of the most important shifts in the thinking about rights since the French Revolution, the idea of giving rights to people who may not be born for decades, to future generations. And this is a real David versus Goliath struggle, but these are the time rebels of our age. They are trying to stretch the imagination and the practices of the whole legal system in this case. And, at the moment, they haven't been very successful in the US. They've created huge public discussion, but changing the system, of course, is very difficult. But they have influenced landmark law cases around the world for future generation rights in Colombia, in Pakistan, in Uganda, in the Netherlands. So these are just some of the time rebels who I've highlighted in my book. And then you can also find them, for example, in the scientific sphere. You may know about something called the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting the world's and protecting the world's plant biodiversity. They have saved millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. So it's an amazing long-term science project. Well, there's time rebels in the art world, like the Scottish artist Katie Patterson has started a 100-year art project called Future Library, where every year for a century, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread in the Future Library until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees, which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. And the first person to donate a book was Margaret Atwood. And, she's never going to see the book published in her lifetime. Yeah. She's never going to meet any of the readers. But that's all about being a time rebel in a way. It's about moving beyond the present, moving beyond the boundaries of your own lifetime, thinking incredibly long term. So I'm all ready for this rising time rebel movement that's emerging around the world. And I want to inspire people to become part of it.
Yeah, I love that. I think that it's kind of fun because like being a rebel is just it's like being a punk, it's like, don't you want to be a punk, And
yeah, well, that's why I used it actually. In fact, just yesterday, I gave a talk to about 5,000 school kids around the world. There's this amazing project called Climate Action Day. And I specifically focused on the language of the time rebel. As a way of trying to energizing them around taking action on climate change and other long-term issues. This is an age of rebellion, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, Time Rebellion, because we're all dissatisfied, aren't we? We know our political systems are hopeless at dealing with the challenges of our age, technological threats, ecological threats. There's declining faith in traditional parties. Being a rebel, I think, is a good thing at this moment in history.
Totally. Yeah, and I think I just want to highlight and reflect a couple of things that you said there. One is that, if we think about rights for future people, that is when you start to talk about that with folks, it's like, it kind of is a light bulb moment for them. And I think that it's a really powerful thing. And, this is kind of a controversial thing, but like you can think of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Like you can think of Black Lives Matter as a movement, and then the kind of remixes or weaponizations of it. And some of like the remixes, which were okay, were things like Native Lives Matter or Latino Lives Matter. And then the remixes, which were not okay, quote unquote, were the like weaponizations of, All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. And then there's this one of like Future Lives Matter. And so thinking about that as kind of an aggressive way to get this onto folks' minds is one thing. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is, the Our Children's Trust piece. It's really cool that you talk about, it's a new legal battle. And then in your book, you also talk about some legal battles that are happening for rights, not only for future people, but rights for land, which we haven't really had before. And then the final thing I want to say was the seed vault. Did you see the Oreo vault? I guess they're making an Oreo vault next to the seed vault.
No, I didn't. That sounds amazing.
I'll share it with you afterwards. Yeah, I think it's like keep the same idea with the seed vault, but instead keep the Oreos for as long as possible. So a kind of long-term thinking.
Yeah, actually, just to say, can I just say
Yeah.
briefly on Black Lives Matter? It's
Yeah.
really interesting, actually, because one of the things I discuss in this book, The Good Ancestor, is the idea that we've colonized the future, that we treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there and future generations aren't here to do anything about it. And it's really interesting, of course, when you're talking about that language, or I'm talking about that language of decolonizing the future. It connects with that idea of decolonization, which has come up in Black Lives Matter. And what I found really interesting amongst a lot of activists involved in the Black Lives Matter movement is that the whole idea of being a good ancestor really speaks to the issues. There's, a great writer called Layla F. Saad, who's written a book called Me and White Supremacy. And she talks about being a good ancestor on the first page of her book. And I think what she's really trying to get at is that a lot of issues, for example, of racial injustice are very much long-term intergenerational ones. These are based on long histories of slavery and colonialism. And the racism of today has been passed on from generation to generation through criminal justice institutions, in public culture more broadly, and so on. So I think that's partly why the idea of the good ancestor speaks to a lot of people. And then just connecting with what you mentioned about rights for nature, there's a really interesting movement there, as you say, not only rights for future people, but in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Wanganui River, sacred to local Maori people, has been given the same rights as a person, in the same way that corporations were given rights in the late 19th century. Rights as a person, or in India, the Ganges River and the Yamuna rivers. So this is another whole area of massive legal shift.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think one question actually I want to ask for you, because again, coming up, the decolonizing the future again is a great language phrase here. How do you kind of like going to the meta level for a second? How, from like a craftsman perspective, how do you think about language construction, or how language plays a role in the spreading of ideas, or how did you come to these language pieces that you had in the book? Tell us a little bit more about like that crafts project.
Yeah, I think for me, it really goes back to reading a book called Metaphors We Live
Mm,
by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, which was, I think, written in the early 1980s. But I started realizing that the metaphors we use, the language we use, shape everything. They talk in that book about the idea that we have a metaphor of argument is war. So you defend an argument, or you attack an argument, you shore it up, and so on, you win and lose it. So there's all this sort of military language around it. And then, of course, there have been all those debates in the US talking about the idea of tax relief or tax justice. It's a totally different way of framing things. So I've always been really interested in how we frame stuff. And I think the idea of the colonizing of the future, for me personally, is a really interesting one, because I'm Australian, actually. And, Australia has this history of colonizing and destroying the lives of indigenous people and stealing their lands. And in the 18th and 19th century, when Britain colonized Australia, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius. The continent was treated as nobody's land, as if there were no indigenous people. Of course, there were. And I think now what we've also got is not terra nullius, but we've also got tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited territory that is ours for the taking, ours for the pillaging. So when I'm tackling an intellectual problem like this problem of our short-term society, I'm constantly trying to think of what are the narratives which are shaping us. And one more thing to say on decolonizing and colonizing, of course, that in the 20th century, anti-colonial wars, the decolonizing wars, kicking the French out of Algeria and so on, those were fought with arms, with weapons. I think this struggle to liberate future generations from the domination of the present is one that primarily needs to be fought with ideas. We need to challenge our language, our thinking around short-termism, and really start using our capacity to be acorn brain thinkers, to think beyond the here and now.
Yeah, I like that. And I think it's interesting that Metaphors to Live By was one of the more impactful books for you as you think about language. And I guess it gives a great overview of, yeah, how, these metaphors for how we think about things change the way we think about them. I want to go one click deeper on that though. Like when you're, writing the book, or when you're crafting these things, or when you're thinking about, you made the terra nullius versus tempus nullius, distinction. Is there like, if I wanted, or if one of the readers wanted to get better at the craft of metaphorization, or something like that, what's that process look like for you? Do you have any like tips for folks on how to do that besides reading Metaphors to Live By?
I think it's really about becoming a detective of your own language, to listen to yourself. And, just at the end of each day, you can write down, well, what were the metaphors that I was using when I was having that argument with my daughter, or when I was trying to make that point at work, or when I was arguing in the bar with my friend about Trump versus Biden, or whatever it is. To, once we start seeing the way that we're using language, and then you just start analyzing it automatically when you're watching a news program or something like that, and you develop a heightened awareness. And I think with a lot of things about life, I think it's about you become a detective of yourself, and that's how we become creatures that are driven by purpose and meaning. We self-reflect. We understand who we are. Know thyself, the old Socratic idea. But certainly, I think we need to do that with our own language, and then I think you can start thinking about how to then frame the stuff that you're interested in. But I have no magic sort of formulas for doing that. Probably apart from reading Metaphors We Live By, or another book by George Lakoff. I can't remember what it's called. It's something, I think it's called Don't Think of an Elephant, which is another one of his later books, which is probably a little bit less abstract, a bit more accessible.
Yeah, I like that. And I think that what you said is true though, which is, and is helpful advice for folks, which is, for so many of us, speaking is our default mode and language is our default mode. And so as we're either doing it outwardly in speaking or writing, or if we're consuming it in listening or reading, we kind of just consume without thinking about how the language is changing or things like that. And so even just becoming aware of yourself and how you're consuming things in the language that people are using, I think is a great first step. So that I think that's good enough for me. No toolkit or framework necessary. I also want to state that I really like what you talked about with the terra nullius and the terra and the tempus nullius. In looping back to a thing we chatted about at the beginning, there's this great Cory Doctorow piece about how terra nullius, this idea of a blank slate of land, is used with copyright law, and how copyright law is like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I was, going through the world and I came up with this musical idea or whatever. It's like, well, actually, you stood on the shoulders of giants. There's this whole like ecosystem before you that came before you. And just like we were talking about at the beginning with you, it's like you're highlighting this idea and providing awesome new language to it. And also, it's not like there was a blank slate of like no long-term thinking before, you came up with these things. So I think I like that. And I especially like the taking it and saying, hey, tempus nullius, there's a blank slate for time here. And that's not actually true. There's like people in the future that we should care about as well. So thinking of blank slates is bad.
That's really fascinating. In fact, I haven't read that Cory Doctorow piece, though I've read a couple of his books and think they're great, and I'll look that up. But yeah, absolutely. I'm constantly standing on the shoulders of giants and playing around with other people's ideas and getting those ideas to try and talk to each other in new ways.
Yeah. So I think I have a question here. Thinking about, we've been chatting a lot about these ideas here and like kind of the language piece, but I think that I know for me personally, a lot of the pushback I get from folks is like, okay, you're just too abstractifying, like how do you think, there's, especially I live in, San Francisco, and there's this, techno utopian kind of builder, startup mindset of like, oh, you have to be building, blah, blah, blah. And how do you think about how these ideas that you're talking about actually get manifest in society? Like, what's your like theory of change here?
Yeah, well, I definitely believe, as we were talking about earlier, about the power of ideas to change society. I really think that we are swimming around in an ethnosphere, to borrow a term from the anthropologist Wade Davis, the swirl of ideas which shape our thinking. And, I once wrote a book called The Wonder Box, Curious Histories of How to Live, or in the US, I think it was called How Should We Live? And that book was based on the idea that the ideas we've inherited from the past shape us today. So, for example, the ancient Greeks had like at least 6 different words for love, and had different concepts of love. And they saw love in many different ways. They didn't just have the romantic love of eros, but there was a charitable or selfless love called agape. And then there was philia, which was their word for a kind of deep brotherly love, the kind of comrade that you might sacrifice for on the battlefield. But by the 18th century, this is just one example about love, the idea of eros became very dominant. So our idea of love is very much about a kind of romantic notion about finding one's soulmate and so on. But that hasn't always been how love has been thought about and lived out in the past. So when you come from that kind of perspective, when you really believe that the ideas that we swim around in the ethnosphere shape our actions, well, that then very influences at least what I do in terms of how I think change happens in society. I think that we need to introduce the new ideas, but of course the question is, how do you do it? They need to be put in education systems and religion and legal and political institutions in the way we structure our economies. And of course, then those ideas then start shaping the way people's lives are lived out. But of course, it doesn't mean that I don't think we should be trying directly to change political systems or economic structures. There is a dance between ideas and structures. It isn't just that the structures are built on that only come out of the ideas. So I'm constantly trying to do both, as it were. So on the one hand, I'll write a book called The Good Ancestor, but I do work with and try and promote the movements which I think really embody those ideas. So one that just came to my mind, for example, is in Japan, there's this amazing political movement called Future Design, which is all about local government decision making. And it's actually influenced by the Native American idea of 7th generation decision making. There's a big idea that has really had a lot of influence around the world. So that idea of 7th generation thinking has influenced this movement in Japan. And what they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they tend to divide people into 2 groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these almost ceremonial robes to wear and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060 come up with much more radical plans, whether it's healthcare investment or climate change action or dealing with COVID in the towns and cities where they are. And this method is now spreading across Japan. It's used in Kyoto and in the Ministry of Finance. I'd love to see it spreading in progressive cities and communities around the world. But there's just a great example to respond to the pushback you might sometimes get about ideas is, that movement has taken the Native American idea of 7th generation thinking, which can be found in Iroquois communities, Lakota communities, and put it into practice in something in a way very mundane, which is trying to decide what the water rates should be in a small Japanese town. It's a classic idea of ideas influencing the world. So in terms of the theory of change, that is partly how I look at it. But I've written a lot about theories of change in the past in my previous work. But that power of ideas is the ultimate leverage point. This goes back really to the idea of systems thinking, which I know you've done a lot of discussions around, a lot of thinking around. And if you look at the work of someone like Donella Meadows, there you see, well, what's the ultimate lever for changing society? It's not tinkering with the tax rates. It's actually changing the paradigm in which you are operating. You're changing the core ideas in which our social and political lives get played out.
Totally. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good. I think that would allay the responses of various folks, and that's like, yeah, we have this ethnosphere, and that ethnosphere does impact our our institutions, and there's this dance, and I like you've said that word a couple times. I think that this dance, this system, this loop, this dialectic or whatever between the ideas and the structures, that's a nice back and forth, and that these happens. It's just happening all around the world all the time. And it's kind of funny because I think there's we think about how, for example, this future design crew, how they got this idea of 7th generation from, the Iroquois communities and things like that. And there's no, that like direct, I think that one difficult thing that people might not get here is because ideas are abstract, and because there's no direct like causal link, it's hard to see like, oh, and there's no like value exchange there. It's like, it's not like future design people in Japan paid money to like, Native American communities in America for this idea of seventh generation. And so I think some of those things that make it less legible for folks, makes it seem like the ideas have less of an impact. um I
That's a really interesting point, actually. I hadn't
yeah,
thought about that, but I think that's probably true, that the influence of ideas on society are less legible than the more obvious things, like government policies, or the pronouncements of big leaders, or the actions of social movement on the streets and things like that. I think you're right.
totally. Yeah. And I guess that I hope that in the future, as we get better and better at, thinking abstractly and thinking in terms of paradigms and how ideas, shape society, that we will have more legible or clear kind of causal loops there or something. I do
Yeah, I
actually
mean, can I
go
just say just one
ahead.
little
Yeah.
tiny addition there? Of course, there are some parts of society where the ideas are made very clear, like in religions, they might write down their Ten
Hmm.
Commandments or things like that. You can start seeing the ideas that shape their worldviews, but in other parts of society, those ideas aren't very clearly articulated.
Well, and let's actually pull on that string for a little bit longer, because I think I agree with you. And I think that there's if you think about the future of humanity and how religion in the West is going down a bit, and that the agnostic or spiritual or atheistic folks are coming up, but people are still searching for meaning and purpose, and also for some of these like moral codes. Do you imagine, or do you have any examples in your mind of, I don't remember any of these from the book specifically, of like people, like religions, quote unquote, that care about the future or like implement them into like, codes of conduct or norms?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And I've spent a bit of time trying to think about this. Um, of course, it depends what perspective you're coming from. Now, for my book, I went and interviewed some people in the Vatican, officials in the Vatican. Of course, they were telling me about Pope Francis's recent pronouncements in his papal encyclical Laudato Si, Praise Be, where he talks explicitly about intergenerational solidarity and intergenerational justice. And this is a kind of quite new language in the Catholic Church. So I'm not saying it's necessarily played out in practice, but certainly the rhetoric is there. Or the other day, I was having a conversation with a Japanese Buddhist monk, and he was pointing out that there is a philosophy of long-term thinking in his approach to Buddhism, or certain kinds of Japanese Buddhism, but it comes via an immersion in the present. By meditating and being in the now, you're kind of transcending time. And then, of course, there are those religions that have ideas of reincarnation to cross time. But I think what's probably the most dynamic area of change, at least in the last 50 years, let's
Hmm.
say, has been a kind of new religion that has risen up with long term vision over the last half century. And it doesn't look like a normal religion. It's called the Global Environmental Movement.
Hmm.
I mean, since the 60s and 70s, hundreds of thousands of environmental organizations of different kinds and persuasions have emerged around the world, but they all share a kind of religious centerpiece, which is the idea of the sacredness of the earth. They worship Gaia. Of course, they don't necessarily bow down in front of Gaia, in front of planet Earth, or necessarily have any religious language in their mission statements, but they're all kind of trying to do the same thing, which is treat the earth as something sacred, something that should be passed on intact or improved to the next generation. And that's really a kind of semi-religious idea. So in there has become a kind of a package of thought and action, the environmental movement, which I think has married itself quite well with the rise of secularism and agnosticism, because there's a whole set of meanings that you can get from that, right? People who are committed to ecological justice, environmental justice, it's giving them that same kind of sense of purpose and transcendent cause, or concrete assignment, to use a term from the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl. Sorry, existential psychotherapist, not psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl. That having a kind of a big goal to aim at, what the ancient Greeks called a telos, but we're getting that from a kind of massive decentralized religion, which is what environmental movement is. It doesn't quite have that same problems of hierarchy and control power like the Catholic Church,
Hmm.
but it's giving us a long-term vision, right? To preserve the one and only planet we know that on which life can survive and on which it has evolved.
Totally. Yeah, I like that. And I think that I like both things that you said there. One is that the existing religions will have to kind of update their doctrine and teaching to, be with the times. And so, Pope Francis is updating and Buddhists are updating. So everybody will kind of, as we need to, as a society, care more about climate change and existential risks, then we will need to, religions will update and kind of become more competitive in the religious environment by also caring about that thing. And then also, as you note, there's also the like new ones that are showing up. And I think the environmental movement is a good one. There's other stuff like, kind of some of the effective altruist movement folks. And I think that there's, even thinking back to the 70s and stuff like world peace and, nuclear security. I think all these things share, as you say, the sense of, the concrete assignment of, hey, let's like protect the earth and get all behind this like long-termist idea. So I like that. Do you think though, I mean, I think we're all, you and I here are kind of on the, we're, we're into long-term thinking. You wrote a book about it. I'm interviewing you about it. I feel like there could be other pushback of just like, is there actually hope though? I mean, obviously you got someone like Greta who's into it, who's an amazing time rebel, young kid, who's going to live for a long, and she'll be here for all the climate or for a lot of the climate crisis. But like, is there actually like, do you get sad, or like, is there hope with all these things?
Oh, I go up and down in a tumultuous storm of emotions and thought with regard to that kind of question. Because on the one hand, I do genuinely see a time rebel movement emerging. I'm not a naturally optimistic person. I have quite an apocalyptic view of the future in many ways. That's why I sit around watching films like Blade Runner 2049, or I've just been watching the brilliant Brazilian sci-fi dystopian series called The 3%. Highly recommended. I can recommend that. But when I'm, thinking, in terms of in a hopeful sense, I get some of my hope from history. I read something really extraordinary once, which is that in the 18th century, major figures like the political economist Adam Smith didn't even know there was an industrial revolution going on, and he was right in the middle of it. He couldn't see it because it was fragmented and contingent. And I find that a really extraordinary thought that we might be in a transformative period now of the rise of a circular economy and these legal movements for future generations and all this kind of stuff. And it doesn't look like there's a big change when you've still got dominance by big fossil fuel companies and now big tech companies. But actually, we might be in the emergence of a new regenerative society with long-term vision that cares about both people and planet into the long future. So that's on the one side. On the other side, well, of course, I certainly don't think this is a majority view that I have by any chance. And the struggles that we face in the 21st century are absolutely enormous. I mean, we already know that global temperatures by the end of the century will probably go up 3 or 4 degrees and sea levels up 1 or 2 meters if we go on business as usual or even a reasonably reformist path. This is inevitable, pretty much inevitable. We know a lot about the future. And with that, well, what comes with it? By 2050, we'll have not 220 million refugees as we have today, but we'll have 400 million or maybe 500 million. And that brings enormous social dislocation. And of course, if you're a refugee, like my father was when he came to Australia from Poland after the Second World War, he was just thinking about the here and now, about trying to deal with his immediate problems of, food and housing and all that kind of stuff. And so, when you're living on the margins, you are on some level necessarily just thinking about your immediate needs. And we can see this with the rise of far-right populism across North America, Brazil, across Europe. When people are insecure, they are thinking about the here and now and tend not to be thinking so long term. And we are certainly facing a century of massive insecurity and instability. And it makes people, go into a kind of fight or flight. So even though there's this emerging time rebel movement that I write about and really believe in, what it's fighting against is a really fundamental, in many ways, the fundamental needs that people have for immediate security. But on the other hand, let me just qualify that with one thing, Reese, which is the idea that, even people living on the social margins can have a very, very long-term vision. Just think of that Native American idea of seventh generation thinking. That's not like a highly privileged part of society where that kind of principles of ecological stewardship are played out. Or in Maori culture in New Zealand, the idea of whakapapa is the Maori idea of genealogy or lineage, the idea in a long chain of life going far into the past and long into the future. The light happens to be shining on the here and now. We've got to spread it more widely. But it's not like Maori peoples in Aotearoa and New Zealand are privileged in society. In fact, they're often the least privileged people in society. So there's not like a direct relationship between your economic status and your capacity to think long term. Often, people who are poor, down and out, refugees, they really care about what they are passing on to the kids and the inheritance they want to leave for the future.
Yeah, I like that. So I think there's a couple juicy things in there. I think that this time, the 21st century, it's almost difficult to underestimate or to overestimate how uncertain and fragile it's going to be, and how it's going to create so much more of that, that scarcity mindset within folks, and that, that authoritarian reflex towards more, security and consistency within folks. And also, as you say, it is not, we do have this ability to think long term, both if you are out of that and if you are experiencing abundance, and if you are, still, if less privileged or poor or what have you, you can still think long term. That's one I think that I want to dive in for a second on, which is, I think that's something that, on this show I often talk about, is that there's, right now, I mean, studies show that after a certain amount of money, you don't get happier. And so for individuals, this is like, between $45,000 and like $70,000 a year or whatever. And so a lot of folks, the crazy thing is that there are a lot of folks in, developed countries are actually past that point. And where, for me personally, I know I self-tax myself 10% of my income, because like the rest of the money is not going to help. And so I can kind of operate from that. It's like I'm in easy mode for operating from that long-term perspective. And I think that by emphasizing that, and maybe it's just because my listeners are more like that and I don't like chat with that many people who are in extreme poverty or whatever, I think I overemphasize perhaps the like how privilege or, abundance then allows one to do long-term thinking. On the other side, there's this like, hey, how can kind of low income folks or, disadvantaged folks also, how do they do long-term thinking as well? I guess I'm not sure. How are you thinking about, that tension there, or like how long-term thinking, I don't know, can be, or am I talking about that wrong, where I'm kind of overemphasizing the fact that like rich people should like really self-tax themselves more? What do you think about that?
Oh, there's lots of things in there. I mean, first thing I would say would be that what I found is often it's the most privileged parts of society have the biggest problem with thinking really long term. The classic case is a kind of aristocrat who has a very narrow idea of what their legacy should be. It's about passing on the family home or land just to the next generation and keeping it in the bloodline, but it's not about any sense of responsibility for the universal strangers of the future, for something much bigger than just their own family lineage. And of course, if we're going to be good ancestors, we have to widen the perspective of who our ancestors are, and who our descendants are. We've got to have a more transcendental sense of where our obligations, our responsibilities lie. I mean, I certainly like that, the idea, and then, the movement of, people like yourself, taxing themselves 10%, giving what you can. These kinds of movements are really important. And obviously it's more privileged people in society who can do that. But of course, when you're on the social margins, the poor and the powerless often are passing on different things rather than material things. I did a lot of research in Guatemala with Mayan indigenous peoples in the 1990s. They were very intent on passing on things, preserving their culture, preserving their language. And this partly comes out of having very strong community bonds. And you find this in religious groups too, sometimes even in sports teams, a sense of the long term coming through being part of a community and knowing that they're going to be members of this community long into the future. Even New Zealand's rugby team, the All Blacks, they're called, the rugby union team, they live by this philosophy and play by this Maori philosophy of whakapapa that I mentioned, the idea of respecting people in the past and future, the idea of wearing their jersey, their All Black jumper, which they play in. It's a sort of a sign of something that they must respect. It's almost something sacred, and they need to, play well and respect the team and sort of not soil the reputation of the New Zealand rugby team through, being, drinking and getting in brawls on the street, whatever it is, all sorts of things, which is all about preserving the idea of the team as a community. And so I think there's this potential for long-termism in all sorts of structured communities. I think it's harder when societies break down, when we become individualized and animized.
Yeah, I like that. I think that it's similar to kind of the legibility thing we were chatting about before. Where it's like it's both easy mode and more legible for someone like me to quote unquote think long term by just like self taxing myself 10%. And uh, also, there are folks who are in more positions where they have a more of a scarcity mindset, and they too can think long term, but it might not be the same like self taxing the money thing. So one thing that we chat about there that I want to kind of wrap up with as we get to the last 5 or 10 minutes of our conversation is we chat about the scarcity in society and kind of the instability and the what I would call, or what Engelhardt would call, the authoritarian reflex here. How does and we just had an election in the United States which looks very likely to go for Biden, but where Trump got a lot of votes, and you just had Brexit in out there in the UK. How do you connect those, the authoritarianism or, democracy? How do you connect that to kind of these long-term thinking ideas? How do they intertwine with each other?
They intertwine a lot. By the way, you just mentioned Inglehart. Were you thinking of Ronald Inglehart, the
Yep.
sociologist?
Mhm.
Oh, I haven't read him for years. I used to love his work on modernization and postmodernization.
It's good.
Um,
It's real good.
it's good stuff. And in fact, I mean, his work partly inspired my interest in the relationship between democracy and authoritarianism and long-term thinking. Because in my book, I mean, this is to answer your actual question
You're
now
good. You're
about
good.
that authoritarian reflex. In fact, there's one of the really interesting areas of authoritarian reflexes I have found in researching this book, that even people who are sort of apparently progressive in some ways, they'll often throw up their hands and say, "Oh, these politicians, these democratic politicians, they're absolutely hopeless. We can't deal with climate change or tech threats from biosecurity and stuff with them in power. What we need is benign dictators. We need
Mm.
enlightened despots. We need to become more like China. Like, look at their amazing long-term green infrastructure investment. Oh, we need to become more like Singapore. They might have some limits on civil and political rights, but look at their long-term investment in housing and education and healthcare." And so there's this lure towards authoritarian solutions to the stuff that we find difficult. Now, that's a really interesting question. Is it actually true empirically that authoritarian governments perform better than democratic governments when it comes to long-term public policy, for example? And that's something I directly looked at in my book. And I work with a great statistician called Jamie McQuilkin, who's developed something called the Intergenerational Solidarity Index. It's a quantitative measure of long-term government performance for 122 countries across 10 different indicators. Environmental indicators like renewable energy in the energy system or deforestation, economic indicators like wealth inequality, social indicators like long-term investment in primary school education, all put together into a single number. And the Intergenerational Solidarity Index shows that the countries that are on top are countries like Iceland and Sweden, but also some non-wealthy countries like Costa Rica and Uruguay and Sri Lanka. The UK is number 45th out of 122 on long-term public policy. The US is number 65, so not doing very well. But when you plot countries on the Intergenerational Solidarity Index on one axis, and on the other axis you plot their levels of democracy using standard democracy scores, like one
Mhm.
called the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index from the University of Gothenburg, what you find is that a line going 45 degrees upwards, which is basically that the more democratic a country is, the more long-term its public policy, and the less democratic they are, the worse their long-term public policy. So out of the 25 highest scoring countries on this index of intergenerational solidarity, 21 are democracies, and of the 25 lowest scoring ones, 21 are authoritarian governments. In other words, that idea that we should all become, we should have benign despots or enlightened despots, that is just not historically or not empirically accurate. In
Mhm.
fact, the opposite is the case. We need to deepen democracy. Every country could become more democratic, and that's how we're going to get more long-term results. But of course, as we know, in the United States, there are big questions about democracy and its its lifespan. Actually, there's so many challenges to basic rights going on, as we can see during the election counts which have been going on, and the challenging the idea of the legitimacy of one person, one vote. So there's a lot of fragility there in the system.
Totally. Yeah. And I think I like your one note on the Englehart thing is he just in 2018 he wrote a book called Cultural Evolution, and also it's similar to the stuff that you'd read in the past about materialism and post-materialism, but it just kind of updates it with new information and like new values surveys. So I'll send that to you. I like wrote a review of it. And
Yeah,
also
please do. I love that stuff.
it's good. It's good. And I guess for our listeners, just as a note, what there's this famous map called the Engelhart-Weitzel cultural map, and it maps all the countries in the world about what their values, like whether on the x-axis is basic needs values versus self-expression values, and on the y-axis is like traditional values versus like secular values. And so you can see kind of in the top right corner there are folks who are secular and self-expression-y, like a lot of Nordic countries. In the bottom left corner there are folks who are more based in self needs, or like basic needs, and also more traditional or religious, like some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's kind of roughly speaking what that is, I think. And as you're talking about this, like the I like that part in your book, the intergenerational solidarity index. And I do think I hear what you're saying, that like if you want to have a like democracies, the like benevolent dictator or whatever, that's not necessarily a good way to think long term. I guess there's a separate question, which is the dictator a good way to bring more solidarity, a dictator or an authoritarian government a good way to bring more like safety and security in the short term? And I think that's just like a separate question.
Yeah, I mean, I think intuitively we think that because we got the idea that an authoritarian government can sort of bring order. That has always been
Exactly.
the language of authoritarian governments across Latin American history, for example. The idea of order and progress. That's what's on the Brazilian flag, basically. You know, um, but of course, authoritarian governments are also incredibly fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And they're brittle in ways, and they create different kinds of insecurity. So maybe they might protect your borders from outside aggressors, but then if you're trying to express dissent, well, maybe you don't feel very secure. Like if you are somebody who believes in freedom of speech and you happen to live in China. So, I mean, I think there's different ways of thinking about what security is and how people experience it in those kinds of regimes. But certainly, I don't, have my fingers crossed hoping that a dictator is going to come along and sort out all the problems in the country where I live. I actually have a lot of faith in human beings to do that grassroots change, participatory democracy. I'd like to revive the ancient Greek kind of ideal of citizen assemblies, but widening it out from just well-off men to everyone in society, including teenagers, who I think can be part of our democratic discussion. So we really, when we're thinking about long-term thinking, we envisage a plurality of futures, the futures of people from many different perspectives and walks of life.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and I think the hope is that going forward into the future, that we will have these beautiful bottom-up, democratic institutions that also, co-evolve with technology and digital technology in this great way. And embedded within them are this new ethnosphere of long-term thinking, and then it gets embedded in community, committees, government committees, and laws, and all these kind of things. So excited for that future. So as we wrap up here, Roman, is there a place as a note for folks? Yeah, it's a great book. I really like, and I've read a good amount of like random long-term thinking books, and I think that The Good Ancestor, for me, I liked it because it just provided, I mean, the language that we've been chatting about this whole time, Roman, is really good. It provides you with a lot of kind of concept handles or, metaphors to think about this. So I think that's great. And also it just does a good job of providing tons and tons of case studies, like the seed vault or like, the Oreo vault or whatever. So the book just came out in the United States, which is great. Roman, is there anything else, like where can people find, or anything else you'd like to say to our listeners?
No, I think we've had a really interesting conversation. I've really loved it. And if people want to find out more about my work, apart from looking at that book, go to my website, romankrznaric.com, and you'll find all sorts of videos and cartoons and podcasts and other stuff about long-term thinking. And also what I've got there on my website is a resource list of long-term thinking organizations. So you can find out about Our Children's Trust or the Future Design Movement in Japan I mentioned, or films or music, which are all about long-term thinking. Remember, there's a whole flotilla, a whole bevy of time rebels out there. And you can go out there and connect with those that give you energy and inspiration.
Totally. And get into that time rebel before, like, if you want to be a hipster, like a time hipster, now is the time, because 10 to 50 years from now it's going to be less cool, and so now is the time to be a time rebel. Well, thank you again for coming on the show, Roman. I really enjoyed the conversation too. It's fun to be in the same kind of ethnosphere as you as well. So thanks for coming on, and thanks listeners for coming and listening to us. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Hope you enjoyed today's episode. I really enjoyed it. I think that it's cool how aligned Roman and I seem to be about how we view the world, and I really liked his perspective on language. As one kind of meta note here, I'm trying to be funnier in my podcasts and also in my reflections, trying to do more satire. I think that's a role that I could play in society. And so I want to try that out here for a second, just some stand-up, or whatever you want to call this. Just, one thing that's kind of funny is airplane food. No. Time rebels. That's a funny term because it is rebellious. It's like, usually when you're a kid, you imagine you're like high school, the kind of rebellious kid in high school. He or she wore black clothes, goth stuff, as a punk, it's like in a mosh pit hitting each other, whatever, and they're rebelling against their parents. And what we're doing is something similar with someone like Greta. Like, the fact that Greta has to be a rebel is so funny. Like, she's just a nerd kid, like an Asperger's-y, autistic-y nerd kid, but she somehow is a rebel because she's just telling it like it is. And it's funny that rebelliousness is, caring about the future. It's like, your parents are up there and they're like, we don't, give a shit about climate change or whatever. And you're like, hey, mom and dad, I'm a rebel. Like, I do care about the future. I care about future generations. I think that's funny. I think that is, I think that's funny. Okay, that's me trying to be funny. Moving on. So I want to talk about two things, language and religion. And the first one on language, there's going to be kind of a lot here, but yeah, we chatted a lot about language in the episode today with Roman, and part of that is, this concept of metaphors we live by, which is this great book by Lakoff, and it's this idea, there's that book by Lakoff, and there's this other idea, or this other book called The Unfolding of Language by Guy Duschster, and that book, Unfolding of Language, talks about how metaphors are, in Lakoff's book, he talks about, argument as war, using thinking of things that we do in life in metaphorical terms. And this Unfolding of Language book is great because it shows that metaphors are how we as society have evolved language, where language started as us talking about the physical world, and then we started to need to represent abstract concepts, and we did so by speaking about them in terms of physical metaphors. So saying someone is at the bottom of the corporate ladder is a good example of this. These, or another example, this is, at the beginning, when we just had pictographs, they were literal, abstract concepts that took, a buffalo and put it onto the cave painting wall. And so that's kind of like a direct physical representation into the symbolic. And so, I think that when you think about this and, how the metaphors that we use today, and the ones especially that we use right now in late-stage capitalism, the question is, are there post-capitalist metaphors that we can and should be using? And so I want to explore some of those for a bit. First is, the classic ideas of competition versus, and war versus co-evolution or co-opetition in a dance. I think that's why I love this idea of dance so much. It's this physical metaphor for how we should actually feel about battling versus each other, or not battling as we're dancing with each other. Another thing that makes me think of is just the co-prefix, co-housing, co-living, co-partnering, co-evolution. And that co-prefix and seeing in your mind the kind of two fists at a similar height is a good physical metaphor. if we move on to some of these other ideas of, post-capitalism and self-taxing and generosity, these are the ideas that, for me, I self-tax 10% of my income. That idea being the physical metaphor here is overflow. That when we have this, the quote-unquote now me overflow, that allows us to give back to others. And this is versus the physical metaphor of being on the hamster wheel, or moving up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That is true to some extent, but we need to think of the bottoms of the pyramid. That doesn't totally get it, because it doesn't show this interconnectedness that we can actually get enough and get some of our needs met, and then let that value kind of flow to others. That only happens when we use this water metaphor and this overflow metaphor. Imagine it as like an ice tray. And so, yeah, and this idea of, hey, instead of being on this hamster wheel, we can instead, have enoughness, be full, that we can sit and I'm not sure the exact metaphor here, but it is, being present, or being in relationship or something like that, and that it is that we can now have enoughness. This is pretty similar to, as the hamster wheel goes away for income and trying to get more money and get more status, we can instead put that hamster wheel and point it towards our search for meaning, that future me bucket. And there's that's okay. It's okay to search for meaning and to put your hamster wheel there. And this is when you start to engage in these anti-fragile attractors. And the metaphors here are something like orbiting around your meaning, or exploring branches of a tree, or gaining texture within meditation or relationships or your garden or what have you, and co-journeying towards these things with others, hand in hand. Those are some of the metaphors for meaning that I'm thinking about. There's other stuff, though, on this range of money as a, water and as a resource. And part of it is, this idea of positive sum stuff growing the pie versus, zero sum stuff redividing it, and using that, pie metaphor is pretty powerful. I think that there's a related one is this idea of pools, and that we can, if I have, it's a direct water metaphor, which is nice, is that, the money goes to me, I allow it to flow through me, and then I can put it towards these pools, which are essentially grant-making entities where other folks can kind of pull out of it, or, use them as faucets. Faucet is a, cryptocurrency term for a thing that you can pull from and get money. And yes, I think the pool metaphor is really powerful. I'm wondering, there's some related ones here around stakeholder and shareholder capitalism, like the ownership economy. I don't think those metaphors are that great. I mean, those terms are fine, but I wonder if there's some better physical metaphors that we can use there that would really, show what we mean by a, stakeholder capitalism. Another one that's related to all this stuff is, all the metaphors around individualism. And, I'm pretty anti-individualism these days. And one way to think against that is, standing on the shoulder of giants, instead of thinking of, the blank slate and that, I came up with this idea to have the Reese Show podcast. It's like, no, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. And so would be curious for other metaphors there for collectivism. So that's one big bucket there of all these kind of metaphors around money and the bento 2x2. I think there's other metaphors here around, another root pillar, which is coherent pluralism. And the, simplest metaphor here is just, the lens, where we have we are socialized in childhood and institutionalized, and we can escape those things and put on new lenses for ourselves. And that's a helpful way to think about this, different colored lenses that we use to address society. And you can even see this happening in internet speak with stuff like red pill and blue pill as, physical manifestations of learning new lenses, or getting woke, becoming awake to these ideas. So I really like lens as an idea, or glasses. Another very connected one here is, the symbolic and the real, and especially the map and the territory. What a delightful metaphor that you have the territory underneath, aka the real, and then the map on top. That is helpful and crucial for understanding the world as it is, and for our perceptions of the world as it is, and for our perceptions of those perceptions. I wish there was a better metaphor for simulacra, which is the idea of that, like, symbolic stuff just like looping on itself, but whatever. In this vein of coherent pluralism, there's some stuff around intersectionality and social justice activism here that I want to explore for a second. One of them is around, intersectionality is a great metaphor. You can really just get the vibes of a Venn diagram there. I think that there's, this moving walkway metaphor that someone like me, a rich white American straight male, is on this moving walkway where all of society has just opened all the doors. Again, another metaphor here for me, and that's great, and that's why anti-racism is a great kind of language tool to response to that, where it's like, hey, if all the privileged folks are on these moving walkways, I have to be anti those. I can't just move, just do my normal thing, because if I do my normal thing, that would just be continuing racist acts, and so I need to be anti-racist by moving against the moving walkway. I think that one that's interesting here, and just, when you're kind of engaging with cancel culture or engaging with folks around this stuff, there's this term of like microaggression that has some pretty intense physical metaphors to it. Or even, this comes across a lot in language on the internet, where you have people who are claiming that violence of words leads to physical violence. And this is where it's like, trauma and things lead, or that's some of the words that people use here. And I don't know, I just wonder, when we're at a better state in society where, these microaggressions, which I think is, again, a good term for what we mean, or for I think it's a good thing that talks about what's happening when people are just like speaking randomly and then accidentally say something that is racist or sexist or whatever. I think that's a good term, but you can imagine a different thing, a different version of reality, where we call them something like micro mistakes or I love this idea of lend me your ideas that aren't yet fully formed. And that has this kind of like physical metaphor for me, where you are baking something or whatever, and you're like, you show it to someone, you're like, I don't really know what this is like, but like, can you check it out or whatever? It's fuzzy, something like that. So I think I'm curious to see how microaggression as a term changes as we get better at not doing it, and also not, ostracizing folks for doing it. This leads to a big section of ones all about the internet as a breeding ground for physical metaphors, and as and so I think that there's like, there's a whole book about this called Algorithms We Live By, and these are things like, breadth first versus depth first search, where we can, that's a computer science algorithm, where if you're trying to find someone to marry at the beginning, it's probably good to do breadth first, where you kind of try out a bunch of different people and then choose somebody and like go depth with them or whatever. And so there's a couple of metaphors like this, like when people in conversations these days, people say, oh, let's double click on that, they used, so that is, or, the classic, so that's when the computer world comes into our other language, and then it can also happen vice versa, where the physical world comes into the computer world with stuff like the trash can icon. And so, as we think about the computers and the internet here, part of these physical metaphors are things like the fire hose of information, or the feed. We have this feed. And again, we should rethink, should we call it the feed, or can we call it something like, something like Rome Research? It's like, it's a network graph. That's something that we probably want more, instead of just having like a feed. Similarly, there's this idea of free reach versus free speech, and the physical metaphor of friction, where we've taken information, we've made it frictionless, where it can just fly all over the internet, wherever, and where we need to add friction back to the system. There's some other similar ones like that, with like the metaphor of a public square versus a private in your living room. And so these are kind of end-to-end encryption, or this is like, Twitter, putting a status out to everybody versus, a Snapchat or end-to-end encryption style thing where you're in your living room. And so I think this is all to say that, those are good, helpful metaphors, physical metaphors for thinking about how information flows on the internet. And there is a couple other quick ones here. One is, we can think of the whole thing as this human colossus, or this networked human organism, or, the collective brain, or Moloch. And I'm wondering, those are some good metaphors, and I think the physicality, the human colossus really has a physical aspect to it. And so I'm wondering for something like the networked human organism, if there's a better physical metaphor there. Also, versus, I was just chatting about the public square versus the living room, and a beautiful version of that also is, the dark forest metaphor, or the digital garden, where you have a space that is away from the scary world out there. This is digital Walden ponding, where you can kind of have more vulnerable discussions with folks. And again, those are physical metaphors. So let me say one final note here, kind of back to the human colossus, networked human organism piece. We're moving from this reality, this industrial age reality, where the metaphors were machines, and the metaphors were also centralizing entities like Hobbes's Leviathan, as the state. And the metaphors that we're going to switch to are these bottom-up organism metaphors, like trees and things like that. And so I'm curious to see how we do that. So, those are some things in the juicy metaphor space. And very excited to see how physical metaphors get built into post-capitalist language, and how we can use that language to create better outcomes for us. There's a funny thing here, though, which is that, and I chat about this actually in our last episode, which is in the last episode we chat about the mask emoji and how it went from a sad face to now a happy face. And that's both, it's good because we should be happy in COVID times, and you can be happy while you're wearing a mask, but it's also a little bit like Orwellian, where you're like, be happy while you're wearing a mask, and like the symbols don't reflect the reality of the situation. But I think, so we have some of these issues here as well, where it's like, should we call it a feed because that's what it really feels like right now? Or can we call it something different, like a serendipity machine or a Rome network graph or whatever, that is less true for what it exists as today, but is maybe a more aspirational vision? One final question I have here on language is, it's interesting that stuff like, Me Too or Black Lives Matter or Make America Great Again, they don't really have metaphors in them, or they don't have these physical metaphors, and I'm not sure why that's true. That's interesting to me. I think there's something about the binaryization of slogans. I don't know. So I'm curious to learn about the intersection of hashtags and these metaphors. Okay, so that's on language. I want to say one other quick note here on, the theory of change that Roman has, and how long-termism will be manifest in, institutions that we have in reality and society. And I think that one of the most interesting things here, there's like some simple ones where it's like, that there are going to be some laws that protect the rights of future people or the rights of the land, or there's going to be some governmental entities that have, that are future committees or whatever. But I think this religion piece is pretty interesting in thinking about how long-termism will be implemented in religions. It's been, traditionally this has been done with, moralizing gods and using religion and the promise of an afterlife to kind of suck money from folks. And it's interesting to see some proto-examples in things like Earth Day in the environmentalist movement, and how long-termism gets represented there. So I don't have much else to say here, except I am curious to see how the norms of long-termism get built into new religions and codified in their kind of Bill of Rights and Bill of Duties. Great. So, hope you enjoyed this episode and hope you enjoyed this little outro. Bye.